This is the story of Daniel Ashford and his wife Claire Ashford. They had been married for 11 years when the silence between them stopped feeling comfortable. Daniel was a structural engineer who believed in load-bearing calculations and things that held their shape under pressure, and for a long time he believed his marriage was one of those things. Claire was a corporate consultant who traveled often, spoke precisely, and had learned early in their marriage to want less than she deserved. The emotional core of what they built together was never passion, it was reliability, a word that sounds like a foundation but can also be a ceiling. What neither of them acknowledged, not even privately, was how much of their marriage had been constructed around a single misunderstanding, something small that happened 7 years ago, something Daniel had forgotten and Claire had never stopped carrying. The truth was already there, buried in the walls like old wiring, waiting for the house to settle just enough that someone would finally smell the smoke. The Tuesday Claire left for her third business trip in 6 weeks, Daniel noticed she had taken her good suitcase. Not the rolling carry-on she used for overnight stays, but the structured gray Samsonite she reserved for longer trips. The one with the combination lock she had changed 2 years ago and never offered to share. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom watching her zip it closed and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The trip was to Minneapolis. She had told him this on Sunday, then repeated it on Monday the way she sometimes repeated things, with the slight formality of someone reading from a script they had rehearsed. Minneapolis, he had said. Again, the Ralston account, I told you. He hadn't remembered, but that was not unusual. He had difficulty remembering things that felt like they had happened before. Their mornings operated on a kind of mechanical precision that, from the outside, would have looked like contentment. Claire made coffee before he was awake, 2 cups, left his on the counter with exactly the right amount of space beside it for his phone. Daniel fed their cat, a gray named Otto who was indifferent to both of them, and checked the overnight news on his tablet. They moved around each other in the kitchen the way people do when they've memorized each other's choreography, gracefully, without touching. They had not argued in 4 months. This was not a sign of health. Their friend Marcus had joined them for dinner 2 weeks before the trip. Marcus Delaney, who worked in property law and had known Claire since university. He was easy company, the kind of man who talks enough that nobody else has to. Daniel liked him in the distracted way he liked most people in his peripheral social world. That evening, over pasta and the good Burgundy Claire only opened for guests, Marcus had been particularly attentive to Claire, not flirtatiously, thoughtfully. He'd asked about her work in a way that seemed to already know some of the answers, and Claire had responded with an animation Daniel hadn't seen in months, leaning forward slightly, finishing her thoughts. Daniel had watched this and felt something he couldn't name precisely. Not jealousy. Something quieter. The feeling of watching someone be fully themselves in a room you're also sitting in. After Marcus left and they washed the dishes in their synchronized silence, Daniel said, "He seems well." "He's going through a lot," Claire said. "Work stuff." She said nothing more and he didn't ask. That night, lying beside her in the dark, Daniel listened to her breathing slow into sleep and found himself thinking about the suitcase, the combination lock. The fact that when her phone lit up these days, she placed it face down without looking at it when he was nearby, a gesture so small, so habitual now, that he couldn't even be certain it was deliberate. He was not a suspicious man. He prided himself on this. He believed in evidence, in measurable stress, and calculated tolerance. He believed that suspicion without evidence was a structural flaw. It weakened everything around it. But there was something. Some barely perceptible shift in weight. The morning she left, he carried her suitcase to the ride share and kissed her on the cheek in the doorway. She smelled like the cedar soap she'd used for years. She said, "I'll call when I land." She had started saying this again recently, the way she used to in the early years of marriage. And Daniel had taken it as a small sign of warmth returning. He didn't realize until he was back inside, standing in the kitchen with the 2 coffee cups still on the counter. She hadn't had hers. That she had not quite met his eyes when she said it. Otto wound around his ankles, wanting nothing in particular. Daniel poured her untouched coffee down the sink. He didn't follow her that first trip or the second. It was the small inconsistencies that accumulated the way sediment does, slowly, without announcement. until the water is no longer clear. Claire had mentioned the Ralston account twice in 6 weeks, but when Daniel had once, idly, asked what Ralston did, manufacturing, logistics, she had said financial services so quickly it felt like a correction rather than an answer. She had always been private about client work, NDA obligations, she'd remind him, gently but clearly. He had never pushed. He was not by nature a man who pushed. But in March, on the night she returned from the second Minneapolis trip, she showered before she hugged him. He heard the water running as he sat in the living room, the television on low, and he told himself this was nothing. She'd been on a plane. Traveling makes you feel unclean. But he felt the thought arrive anyway, quiet and cold, like water seeping under a door. He had begun noticing her phone habits more precisely than he was comfortable admitting. Not snooping. He hadn't touched it, didn't want to, but observing. She had always been a moderate phone user, someone who left it in the kitchen when they watched television. Now she carried it with her to the bathroom. Now she had switched to vibrate. When he mentioned, offhandedly, that his own phone had started buzzing strange notifications, she had offered too quickly, maybe update the OS, as though she'd been waiting for a reason to say something about phones. Daniel worked late that week by choice. His office was on the 14th floor of a building he had helped design 8 years ago, and sometimes in the evenings, when the floors emptied out, he'd stand at the window and think about load paths, about how a structure transfers stress, how a beam that appears stable is always channeling force somewhere, how nothing simply absorbs pressure, it only redirects it. He was redirecting something. He could feel it. He called his brother Thomas on Thursday evening, not to discuss Claire, but somehow the conversation arrived there anyway. She seems preoccupied, Daniel said. The word felt careful, chosen. With work? Maybe. I don't know what with. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Thomas had been divorced for 3 years and had the particular candor of someone who had survived something. Are you asking me if you should worry? I'm asking why I'm noticing things I didn't notice before. That's the same question, Thomas said. What Daniel hadn't told Thomas, hadn't told anyone, was that he had found something 2 weeks earlier while clearing winter coats from the front closet. In the interior pocket of Claire's charcoal wool coat, the one she wore to professional things, there was a business card. Ms. Delaney, LLP, Family and Civil Law. The card was not new. It had been handled, the corner slightly bent. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, Feb 14 to 3 p.m. Documents. He had stood in the hallway holding the coat for a long time. He told himself it was nothing. Marcus was their friend. Marcus did law. People used friends for legal advice. He put the coat back, slid the coat into the pocket exactly as he'd found it. But February 14th had been a Tuesday. Claire had told him she was at a client lunch that day. He remembered because he had texted her a small joke about Valentine's Day and she had replied with a heart emoji 40 minutes later, 40 minutes, not the usual 3 or 4. He had noticed the delay and done what he usually did with such noticings, filed it somewhere small and quiet and told himself it was nothing. The card sat in the closet. On the night before he decided to follow her, the 4th trip, this one to Chicago, they had dinner together at home. Claire had made risotto, which she only did when she had patience for something slow. She'd opened wine. She had looked across the table at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between affection and exhaustion, the way you look at a photograph of somewhere you used to live. You seem tired, he said. I am tired, she said. A pause. He waited in his way for more. She offered none. Is everything all right? The question felt enormous and insufficient. She turned her wineglass slowly. I think we've stopped asking each other that. I'm asking now. She looked at him. Really looked. The kind of looking that searches. Then she smiled, faintly, in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. It's a work thing. I'll sort it. He nodded. He let her have it. Later, she fell asleep reading, the book open on her chest, and he lay beside her, listening to the traffic outside and the deep, specific quiet that comes from being lonely in a bed with someone else. He booked the same flight. He told himself it was the card. He told himself he just needed to know. He was not a man given to grand gestures or catastrophic decisions. He booked a seat 3 rows behind hers and checked in under his own name and felt, for most of the hour-long flight, like someone doing something shameful and necessary in equal measure. Claire slept on the plane. She always did. He watched the back of her head, the familiar way she tilted it left against the headrest, and tried to remember the last time he had felt certain about her. She took a cab from O'Hare. He took the next one. The hotel she checked into was a quiet, mid-tier business hotel near the financial district. Exactly the kind she always used. Nothing surprising. He checked into a room 2 floors above hers, sat on the bed in his coat, and spent 20 minutes feeling absurd. He nearly called Thomas. He nearly ordered room service and flew home in the morning. Instead, at 2 o'clock, he saw her in the lobby coffee area from across the atrium. She was with Marcus, not with a stranger, not with some unnamed threat. With Marcus Delaney in his good coat, a leather portfolio on the table between them, papers spread across the surface that she was reading with the focused attention she gave. Contracts. Daniel stood behind a column and watched. They were not intimate. There was no touch, no leaning close, no language of something hidden. What he saw was more disorienting than that. They were working. Claire was pointing at a document. Marcus was explaining something. She was nodding, her pen moving. She looked in the precise way Daniel had always loved and somehow forgotten, entirely competent and entirely herself. He returned to his room. He sat for an hour. Then he walked back down and knocked on her door. She opened it in her work-clothes stockings, one earring removed. For a moment, she simply stared at him. The color went out of her face and came back differently. "Daniel, I followed you," he said. "I need you to know that I followed you, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She stepped back. Let him in. The room was neat, her Samsonite open on the luggage stand, documents on the desk. He sat in the chair by the window because standing felt too confrontational. She sat on the edge of the bed. A long silence. The kind neither of them tried to fill quickly. "How long has Marcus been helping you?" he asked. She looked at her hands. "Since January." "With what?" She was quiet for a moment. Not calculating, gathering. He had always known the difference with her. "I've been separating finances," she said carefully. Slowly. "A personal account. Some assets restructured in my name." Marcus drew up preliminary documents. A pause. "I wasn't sure how long it would take me to actually do anything with them." He heard the words and they landed softly, which was worse than if they'd been loud. "You're leaving me. I've been thinking about it." "For how long?" She looked up then. 7 years, Daniel. Off and on, more on than off lately. He did not ask if there was someone else, because he had seen them working at a coffee table and he knew there wasn't. What he asked instead surprised even him. "Why?" She looked at him with something close to disbelief. "You know why." "I don't." "The woman," she said, "at the Edinburgh conference 7 years ago." He was quiet. "I heard you on the phone," she said. "I wasn't meant to. You were in the kitchen and I was on the stairs and you were saying—" She paused, pressed her fingers together. "You were saying, I can't do this anymore. I need to think." And the way you said it, she stopped. He stared at her. The Edinburgh conference. He had been on the phone with Thomas. They had been fighting about their mother's estate, a mess that had lasted 18 months and required 2 attorneys and 1 near-catastrophic falling out. "I can't do this anymore." He remembered saying exactly that. He remembered the kitchen floor, the cold tile. "That was Thomas," he said. "About Mum's estate." She didn't move. "Claire, that was my brother. We were in arbitration." She said nothing for a long time. Outside the window, Chicago spread its orange nighttime light across the low clouds. "I didn't know that," she said finally. "You never asked." "No." Her voice was barely there. "I never asked." He flew home alone the next morning. They agreed to that without discussing it. It was simply understood that they needed the hours separately. that the conversation had expanded into something neither of them could safely navigate in the same contained space. For the first 2 weeks, they lived in the house like people waiting for a decision. Polite, careful. They ate together most nights, which surprised him. He had expected a withdrawal into separateness, but instead there was this strange provisional closeness. Two people aware of how much they had been circling something without landing. Claire called Marcus on the third day. She told him to hold the documents. She said this standing in the kitchen, quietly, and Daniel heard it from the hallway and did not react, only continued to the coffee maker and poured his cup. He had thought, had hoped, in the wordless way hope operates before it becomes an expectation, that the revelation would change something cleanly, that the removal of a misunderstanding would restore what had been there before. He understood now that this was not how it worked. The misunderstanding had been the story she told herself for 7 years, and stories, even wrong ones, reshape the person who carries them. Claire had learned to need less, had learned to build walls with the precision of someone who expected them to be necessary. Knowing the wall had been built for the wrong reason did not automatically dissolve it. She was not cold with him. That was the difficult part. She was present, engaged, occasionally warm in the way she used to be, before warmth became something she rationed. They talked, really talked, for the first time in years, partly because there was nothing left to protect. She told him what the years of quiet assumption had felt like, the constant low vigilance, the way she had started measuring his small absences against her old suspicion, finding evidence where there was none because she had been so certain it was there. He told her what those years had felt like from the other side, the sense of being subtly insufficient, of warmth offered and not quite received, of a marriage that functioned perfectly and somehow felt like moving through glass. "I thought I was the problem," he said one evening. "You thought I didn't love you. I thought you'd decided I wasn't worth full attention." She considered this for a long time. "I thought the same about you. It should have been the opening. The place where the accumulated distance collapsed and they moved toward something rebuilt. And perhaps for a short time, the first month, it was." He found himself noticing her again the way you notice a city you've lived in too long when you finally consider leaving it. The small particular things, the way she held her book, the way she argued with podcasts under her breath while cooking. But clarity about the past is not the same as safety in the present. And Claire, despite herself, despite the knowledge that the wound had been self-inflicted, could not fully unknit the person she had become in the course of protecting it. She began to travel less. She began to leave her phone face up again. These were gestures, and he recognized them as gestures, and felt moved by them, and also terribly sad. One Saturday morning she found him at the table with his coffee and his tablet, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I don't know if I know how to stay." "I know," he said. "That's not the same as saying I want to leave." He looked up at her. "I know that too." It was the most honest exchange they had had in 7 years, possibly longer. It did not fix anything. It only named the shape of the thing they were both inside. In October, 8 months after Chicago, they sold the house. It was a decision that arrived the way certain decisions do, not announced but gradually accepted, like a season changing. The house was listed in August. They packed its contents with a quiet efficiency that bore no resemblance to the arguments they might have had. Daniel kept his drafting table and the good lamp and a set of books they bought on their first trip to Florence 9 years ago. The trip where Claire had drunk too much Chianti and laughed so freely he had thought, This is what I want to build a life inside." He did not tell her he was keeping the Florence books. He didn't need to. She had packed her own things and left them for him. They stood in the empty living room on the last day, waiting for the handoff to the new owners. October light came through the window the way it does in that month, low, specific, the color of things ending gently. Otto was in his carrier. Claire had taken the cat. Daniel had been the one to suggest it, which still surprised him when he thought about it. He had expected this moment to feel like rupture. It felt instead like the last note of something long, long finished, a resolution that had been arriving so slowly he'd almost stopped hearing it. "I'm sorry," Claire said. Not for the first time, but this time without the urgency of the first few times, the need to undo. This was different. This was grief without a fix attached. I know, he said, and then, I'm sorry too, because he had been thinking for months about his own contribution, not to the misunderstanding, which had been bad luck and poor timing, but to the years of low-grade absence that had made the misunderstanding so credible to her. He had not been unfaithful, but he had been inattentive in the specific way of a person who assumes love can subsist on proximity. He had confused being there with being present. She nodded. She was holding Otto's carrier with both hands. He said, the Edinburgh thing. If I had known you'd heard, you would have explained immediately, she said. I know. I should have explained anyway. I should have noticed something had changed. I should have asked. A pause. I couldn't. I was afraid of what you'd confirm. This was the truth of it. She had not asked because she had needed the story to explain her own slow withdrawal. To believe it was response, not initiation. To make her growing emotional distance an act of self-protection rather than a choice. The misunderstanding had been wrong, and she had known it might be wrong, and she had not examined it because examining it would have required asking what else she was responsible for. He understood this. He didn't say it aloud. Some understandings are best carried quietly. They walked out of the house together and stood in the driveway, and she unlocked her car and put Otto in the back seat. Then she stood for a moment with the door open, not quite leaving, not quite staying. Do you think, she said, if we'd talked more earlier? He considered it the way he considered structural problems, not the failure itself, but the cascade of small tolerances that allowed it. Maybe, he said, or maybe we both needed to be different people. She looked at him then, and what was in her face was not regret in the ordinary sense. It was more complex and more final. The face of someone who has seen clearly and found clarity to be, on balance, and sufficient. Take care of yourself, Daniel. You too. She drove away. He stood in the driveway of the house that was no longer his and watched until the car turned the corner. The oak tree in the front yard was already turning. He had planted it the second year they lived there, a sapling, a small, hopeful thing. It was taller than the house now. He picked up his last box and walked to his car and sat for a while without starting the engine. He was not waiting for anything. He was only allowing the weight of the morning to settle, the way weight always eventually settles, redistributing itself through whatever is left standing. He had not lost a wife. He had lost a marriage that had already, quietly, ended years before either of them had understood that something was closing. The love had been real. The distance had been real. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the tragedy was not that one canceled the other, but that for 11 years, for 7 of them in particular, neither of them had possessed the courage to make the two truths speak to each other. He started the car. He drove forward the way you always have to,